The moment I stepped into the restaurant, I regretted wearing beige. I thought it would help me blend in, stay unnoticed. But I should have known better. The chandelier light caught on my silver roots, and the hostess gave me a once-over like I'd wandered in by mistake. I muttered my son's name. Reservation under Carson Montgomery. And she raised an eyebrow but led me to the back, near the private dining area. I could already hear the laughter. Loud, polished. Like people who hadn't worried about rent in decades. It was Carson's birthday. My only son, now 38, surrounded by executives and people whose names I only saw on the quarterly reports of the company I helped build. Yes, I said helped build, but no one in that room knew that. Not even Carson, not really. I stepped through the glass doors like a ghost, and he barely glanced up. "Oh, there she is," he said with a smirk. "The housemaid who never left." The room chuckled, not loud, just enough to sting. I smiled, tight, polite. I walked over and handed him the gift I'd wrapped in navy blue paper. He didn't even open it. "She's still around 'cause she cleans better than the rest," he added, and took a long sip of wine. His girlfriend, a model, I think, wrinkled her nose in confusion. I stood there, frozen, every muscle aching from the effort it took not to cry or storm out. And then, a voice, calm, deep. A man sitting at the end of the table, tan suit, gold cufflinks, leaned forward and said, "Funny, I know exactly who she is." The laughter stopped. Carson blinked. "Excuse me?" he asked. The man smiled, not cruel, but deliberate. "Your maid saved this company once. You really don't recognize her?" The silence in that room hit like thunder. I didn't say a word. I just sat down at the far end of the table, and for the first time in years, I let my back straighten, let my voice come back to me. Because this story isn't about a maid. It's about a woman who sacrificed everything, her career, her identity, her pride, to raise a son who no longer saw her. But tonight, he would. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I hadn't heard that man's voice in over a decade, yet it echoed in my chest like it had just spoken beside me yesterday. Gabriel Langston, that was his name. I hadn't known he would be there tonight, let alone that he'd recognize me. He looked older, of course, a little grayer around the temples, with deeper creases beside his eyes, but he still had that deliberate calm, the kind of confidence you don't inherit, you earn. We hadn't spoken since the merger. Since I walked away from the boardroom table and into the kitchen of the house, I paid off myself. Carson's face flushed. He gave that forced, brittle laugh people use when they're not sure if they're being mocked. "I think there's some mistake," he said. "This is my mother. She hasn't worked in the company in 30 years?" Gabriel said, sipping his water. "Yes, that sounds right. But work is an interesting word, isn't it? I suppose raising the founding capital and designing the first growth plan doesn't count as work when a woman does it quietly." Carson's jaw tightened. He glanced at the others. His girlfriend, the VP of marketing, a junior exec trying too hard to hide her phone under the table. The room had gone completely still. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears, loud as a train. But I didn't speak. Not yet. Gabriel set his glass down. "She's the reason I joined the company. Your mother pitched me herself, back when everyone else in the industry said your father's vision was impossible. She made me believe in it, and frankly, she made me believe in her. If she hadn't stepped back when she did, well, Carson, you might be throwing this party in a very different building." I wish I could say Carson looked ashamed, but he didn't. He looked confused, defensive, like a child caught doing something wrong but too proud to admit it. "That's ancient history," he mumbled. She She was a homemaker. She wanted that life. I finally spoke. I wanted you to have a life I didn't, I said, my voice lower than I expected. But I didn't stop being who I was. I just made myself smaller so you could feel bigger. Carson scoffed, but his eyes flickered. Just for a second. Like maybe he heard the truth under the words. Gabriel looked at me, then back to Carson. If you're smart, he said, you'll start treating your mother like the woman she is, not the version that fits your narrative. The server came to take drink orders, breaking the tension like a knife scraping glass. I excused myself quietly and walked to the restroom, my legs shaking beneath me. In the mirror, I saw my reflection. Not weak, not humiliated, but something else, something I'd buried, something coming back. I splashed cool water on my wrists, my hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sudden shift of gravity in that room. I had spent decades shrinking myself into the corners of Carson's life. And he'd let me. Worse, he'd learned to ignore the cost. But Gabriel hadn't, and I wasn't sure yet whether his words tonight were a warning or the start of something much, much bigger. When I came back to the table, the atmosphere had shifted. There was no more laughter. The wine glasses clinked quieter. Conversation turned more polite, shallow, the kind people reach for when they're avoiding something deeper. Carson didn't look at me. Not once. He kept his eyes on his plate, picking at the lamb chop like it had personally offended him. Gabriel, on the other hand, stood as I returned and pulled out my chair, the only person at the table who acknowledged me like I mattered. "Nice to see you again, Joanna," he said. "Like we just had coffee last week. It's been too long." "It has," I answered. And I meant it. There was history between us, and I don't just mean business. Gabriel was one of the few men who saw me clearly back then, not just as George Montgomery's wife, not just the brains behind the scenes, but as a strategist, a force. And when I left the company, I didn't just walk away from the boardroom, I walked away from him too. I turned to Carson. "You remember Gabriel, don't you?" He nodded stiffly. "Sure. He's on the board now." Gabriel raised an eyebrow. "Vice chairman," he corrected, "and a founding investor." Carson flushed again. I could feel the heat rolling off him, not just embarrassment. Fury. I'd punctured the version of his world where I was invisible, and I knew my presence tonight, my truth, made that world wobble. The waitress brought out the cake, a towering chocolate thing with gold candles. Carson smiled for the pictures. Posed. But his eyes were still cold. He blew out the candles. People clapped. I clapped too, though I didn't feel celebratory. Something sour lingered in the air. Regret, resentment, maybe both. After cake, as guests started checking their watches and collecting coats, Carson leaned toward me. His voice was low, almost a hiss. "Why are you doing this?" I blinked. "Doing what?" He leaned closer, trying to embarrass me. This was supposed to be my night. I stared at him, stunned. "You're the one who called me a maid in front of your entire executive team." He smirked. It was a joke. "No, Carson," I said softly. "It was a habit. You've been diminishing me for years. You just finally had an audience big enough to clap for it." His jaw clenched. "Don't start something you're not ready to finish, Mom." That stopped me. The arrogance. The threat disguised as concern. For years, I'd ignored the signs. The way he rewrote our family history, told people his father built the company alone, introduced me to his colleagues as retired instead of founder. But this was the first time he'd warned me not to speak my truth out loud. And now I realized why. He was afraid of what would happen if I did. I stood up. "You're right, Carson. This was your night. But tomorrow belongs to me." I turned and saw Gabriel watching us from across the room, and I swear, for just a second he gave the faintest nod, like he already knew I wasn't finished. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in the armchair by my window, the same one where I used to rock Carson when he was a baby, back when he reached for me without hesitation, without shame. I watched the sky shift from black to gray, then peach. The city stirred beneath me, but I stayed still. My mind wasn't on the dinner anymore. It was on the decades I had surrendered, the identity I had let erode for the sake of keeping peace in a house that rarely offered it. I thought about Gabriel, about how his voice cut through that room, not like a weapon, but a reminder of who I used to be before I let motherhood become my camouflage, before I started introducing myself as just Carson's mom, instead of Joanna Prescott Montgomery, co-founder of Prescott Tech. At around 8, I got a text. It was from Gabriel. "You have time for coffee today? I think it's overdue." My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I hadn't seen him outside of that dinner in 30 years, but something inside me, something that had been sleeping for too long, pushed me to respond. Yes, let me know where. 2 hours later, we sat across from each other in a quiet cafe near the financial district. Gabriel looked different in daylight, less intimidating, more human. But his eyes hadn't changed. Still sharp, still calculating, but not cold. He studied me for a moment before speaking. "I didn't mean to ambush you last night," he said, stirring his tea. "You didn't," I replied. "You rescued me. Again." He smiled faintly. "You didn't need rescuing. You needed reminding." We sat in silence for a moment, the air thick with everything unspoken. Then he leaned in slightly. "Why did you disappear, Joanna? After George died? You vanished. You let them write you out of everything." "I didn't let them," I said. "I helped them. I thought Carson needed space to grow. I thought if I stayed in the background, he'd learn to lead without resenting me. But instead, he learned to erase me." Gabriel nodded, his expression unreadable. "And now?" "Now," I exhaled. "I'm tired of watching him steer the company into vanity projects and executive retreats, while the foundation we built is crumbling underneath." He tilted his head. "You've been watching?" I nodded. "Of course I have. Every quarterly report, every press release, every lawsuit settlement swept under the rug." His eyes lit up, not with excitement, but with recognition. "You still care." "I never stopped," I said. "And I'm done pretending I did." He set down his cup and leaned forward. "Joanna, the board is frustrated. Carson's leadership is performative, style over substance. If you're ready to step out of the shadows, now's the time." I froze. "You mean, come back?" He nodded slowly. "Not as a ghost, as a force, as the woman who built this." I didn't answer right away. The weight of it pressed against my ribs. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about truth, legacy, reclamation. "I need to think," I said. "But if I do come back, I won't ask for permission." "You never needed it," he said. "You just forgot." As I left the cafe, something shifted in me. The world didn't feel so small anymore. For the first time in years, I wasn't just someone's mother or someone's widow. I was Joanna, and I was ready to remember what that meant. I waited 3 days before doing anything, not because I was hesitant, but because I wanted to be ready. You don't re-enter a battlefield without knowing where the landmines are buried. I opened the dusty fireproof box in my closet, the one I hadn't touched in over 20 years, and pulled out everything, old shareholder certificates. My original co-founder agreement, signed in ink, not email, A stack of business cards with my name on them in raised gold lettering. Joanna Prescott Montgomery, Strategic Development. The paper still smelled faintly of cedar and ambition. Then I opened the laptop I barely used and began taking notes. I read the last 12 quarterly reports, listened to press conferences, jotted down every acquisition Carson had approved in the past 5 years. Half of them ego-driven, none of them profitable. I mapped the decline in market confidence, the layoffs, the scandals he tried to smother with wellness retreats and new logos. And underneath all that gloss, a company with rot in its roots. By the end of the week, I had a 27-page binder labeled Prescott Tech Recovery Strategy. The last page was blank. I was saving it for what came next. I emailed Gabriel, told him I was in. He called immediately. "You sure?" "No," I said. "But I'm done being invisible." He laughed softly. "That's the Joanna I remember." We agreed to meet with a few key board members. Quietly, over lunch, no press, no Carson, just strategy. I wore navy and a string of pearls I hadn't touched in years. As I stepped into the private room of the restaurant, 3 men and 1 woman stood. Only one of them recognized me. Richard Kramer, former CFO, now semi-retired. The others were newer, younger. They saw me as a relic, until I opened my binder. In 15 minutes, I laid out the company's vulnerabilities, how we were over-leveraged in international markets, how Carson's pet projects had cost us not just money, but goodwill with our base investors, how employee morale had dropped to its lowest level in 14 years, and then the pivot. I told them what I would do instead. Realign R&D with long-term goals, restore legacy product focus, reinstate ethical oversight committees that Carson had quietly dissolved. By the time I finished, no one interrupted. Not once. The youngest board member, a 30-something named Peter, cleared his throat and said, "How soon can we get you on the agenda?" "I'm not asking for a seat," I said. "I'm reclaiming the one that was always mine." Silence. And then Gabriel said it clearly, with the weight of authority behind it. "She's coming back, effective immediately." I walked out of that restaurant feeling the heels of my shoes actually sink into the pavement, like I belonged in the world again. But by the time I got home, Carson had already found out. There was a voicemail waiting for me. "You think you're clever," his voice spat. "Going behind my back? Don't test me, Mom. You're not the only one who knows how to play this game." But here's the thing. He taught me how to stay silent, but I taught him everything else. By Monday morning, my name was back on the internal memos, not in bold font, not in headlines, just a quiet line in the executive directory. Senior Strategic Advisor, Joanna Prescott Montgomery. But it was enough. Enough for word to spread like fire through the office halls. I hadn't walked in for nearly 3 decades. I showed up without announcement. I wanted to see the building the way it truly operated, not through a red carpet welcome or forced smiles, but raw and unrehearsed. And what I found confirmed everything in my binder. The receptionist didn't recognize me. She asked if I was here to interview for a cleaning position. I didn't correct her. I just smiled and took the badge she offered. The elevators were newer. The layout was different. But the energy, that hollow, performative buzz, hadn't changed. Gabriel met me on the 13th floor. He was already waiting outside Carson's glass office when I stepped off the elevator. "You're early," he said. "So are you." "I didn't want you walking into that room alone." I glanced through the glass. Carson sat behind his desk, tapping at his phone, completely unaware. A young woman stood beside him, nodding too eagerly. I recognized the posture. I'd worn it once. The "please don't cut me down" stance. "Ready?" Gabriel asked. "No." I said, stepping forward. But let's go anyway. We walked in without knocking. Carson looked up. For a second, he didn't react. Then his lips twitched like a man struggling to maintain dignity while standing on a sinking deck. Well, he said slowly, the revolution has arrived. I didn't sit. I stood in front of his desk, calm but unyielding. This isn't a coup, Carson. It's a correction. He leaned back, hands folded. Do you even know what this company is anymore? Things have changed. Tech isn't about spreadsheets and quarterly discipline. It's about vision, influence. And your version of vision has our stock down 12% this quarter, I said, meeting his eyes. Your influence is costing us investors, credibility, and leadership morale. You're bleeding this place dry. His nostrils flared. Don't come in here and act like you know better. I do know better, I said, because I built better. Gabriel placed a folder on the desk. The board has voted. Joanna has full advisory rights. With review access to all strategic initiatives, she'll be included in planning sessions and budget approvals. Carson snorted. So she gets a shiny title and a seat at the grown-up table. Congratulations. I leaned forward slightly. Carson, I'm not here to humiliate you. I'm here to save what's left. But I won't sit quietly while you burn the company to impress people who forget your name after cocktail hour. He stood abruptly. This is still my company. No, I said, calm but sharp. It's ours, and you've forgotten what that means. He didn't reply. He stared at me like he didn't recognize the woman in front of him. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he'd buried that version of me so deep in his mind that seeing her now felt like watching a ghost rise from the floor. When I walked out, every eye in the hallway turned toward me. Not out of pity, not curiosity, but recognition. The next 48 hours were a storm of whispers, meetings, and calendar reshuffles. My name showed up on inboxes again, not as a CC, but at the top of action items. Gabriel and I sat with legal to review outdated bylaws. I met with product managers who hadn't seen a vision deck in 6 months. HR pulled me aside quietly, thanking me for simply walking the floor, something Carson hadn't done in almost a year. But not everyone welcomed me. On Thursday, I was called into an emergency alignment meeting with Carson, his chief of staff, and 2 investors who'd been overly fond of his champagne-laced charm. I walked in, knowing exactly what it was. A trap. A final, desperate attempt to box me back into the shadows. We want to avoid confusion, Carson said, sitting with his legs crossed too casually. It's important the public sees consistent messaging. Having multiple voices from leadership could dilute the brand. I leaned forward. Your concern for the brand is touching, but I'm not here to echo your press releases. I'm here to fix what you've broken. One of the investors, Henry, a man who once referred to me as George's smart little wife, cleared his throat. Joanna, nobody's questioning your contributions. We just want to make sure we don't create division in front of the media. Perhaps a soft return is better. Behind the scenes. Discreet. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. Henry, let me be perfectly clear. I didn't come back to whisper behind closed doors. I came back because the company is bleeding, and it's time the world saw a woman stitch it back together in broad daylight. Gabriel said nothing. He didn't need to. He knew I had to carve this path myself, and I did. The next morning, I booked the conference room on the top floor, the one reserved for quarterly press briefings. I sent out a memo under my name only. Joanna Prescott Montgomery will be delivering remarks on the future of Prescott Tech. Carson tried to cancel it. I expected that. But Gabriel had already locked in the time. The board was notified. A few select reporters were invited. The room filled faster than expected. Employees, board members, even a few rivals pretending to be consultants. I stood behind the podium, my palms cold, my heart steady. I didn't open with apologies. I opened with memory. I remember the day this company started, I began. It wasn't in a skyscraper or on a stage. It was in our garage, with a whiteboard that didn't hang straight and a coffee pot that always leaked. We didn't have investors. We had grit. We didn't have PR. We had vision. And we didn't chase trends. We built things that solved real problems. I let that sit. Somewhere along the way, that vision got dressed up in tailored suits and influencer partnerships. But I'm here today to say we're going back to what built us: innovation with purpose, leadership with integrity, and progress with accountability. The room was silent, not tense, attentive. Even Carson, standing at the back, wasn't smirking this time. I closed with one line. The Prescott name isn't just legacy, it's promise, and I intend to keep it. When I stepped down, people stood, not because they were told to, because they chose to. The applause echoed in my chest for hours after, not because I needed validation, but because I hadn't realized how much I missed being heard, truly heard. Not placated, not tolerated, not politely dismissed, but respected. It had been so long. But with power comes pushback, and Carson wasn't going down without throwing every stone he could find. The next morning, a headline hit one of the industry blogs: "Founders Return Sparks Internal Feud at Prescott Tech. Board in Turmoil." The article quoted unnamed sources, clearly hand-picked by Carson, accusing me of staging a sentimental power grab. It framed me as out of touch, driven by nostalgia and not strategy. It hinted that Gabriel had orchestrated everything behind closed doors to manipulate aging investors. It was a hit piece, a desperate one, but it stung. Worse, it rattled a few people inside the company. One of the newer executives, a bright woman named Lynn, emailed to ask if I wanted her to respond publicly on my behalf. I thanked her, but declined. I wasn't going to fight shadows with shadows. I had something better: history, truth, and receipts. That afternoon, I held a follow-up meeting with the board. No press. Just 10 chairs around a table, and the weight of 30 years of silence finally ending. I handed out copies of original partnership agreements, financial statements with my name on them, emails from the early days, letters from George, handwritten ones, acknowledging my role in every major company milestone. One of them included a line I hadn't read in years. "Joanna, you are the engine of this company. I only drive it." The room was quiet as pages turned. "I don't care what blogs say," I told them. "This company has always been built on proof. And here it is." Peter, the youngest board member, looked up. "Do you want us to issue a formal correction?" I shook my head. "No, we don't correct noise. We outlast it." Still, the attack rattled something deeper. Carson wasn't just threatened. He was panicking, and panic makes people reckless. 2 days later, the sabotage attempt hit. Our internal systems flagged a suspicious draft, an email that was never sent, but saved to a shared folder under Carson's assistant's name. It outlined a transition plan that proposed restructuring senior leadership, namely, removing my advisory status and consolidating power under a newly created Office of the President, with Carson solely at the top. It wasn't just unapproved, it was illegal, against company policy, and it would have quietly gutted my authority while technically keeping my title, a classic vanity trap. I confronted Carson behind closed doors. "You think I wouldn't find it?" I asked. He didn't deny it, just stared at me, jaw tight. "You made me look weak." "No," I said. You did that yourself. I simply stopped covering for you. He stood slowly, pacing. Do you know what it's like, living in your shadow, always being compared to the great Joanna Prescott, even when you were gone? I didn't blink. You weren't living in my shadow. You were standing in my light and pretending it came from you. He turned away, hands clenched into fists. You want the company? Take it, but don't expect me to sit quietly. I never did, I said, and walked out. Gabriel was waiting in the hallway. We need to act before this turns into a full scandal. I nodded. Call an emergency board vote. It's time. Time for what? He asked. For Carson to choose. Step down with dignity, or be removed without it. The board meeting was set for Monday at 10 a.m., but I arrived at 8. I needed the silence. I needed the stillness of the executive floor before the tension of closed doors and verdicts. I walked past framed photographs on the wall, glossy images of ribbon cuttings, shareholder meetings, and tech expos. Carson's face appeared often. Mine never did. Until now. Gabriel joined me in the conference room 15 minutes later. He looked tired, but steady. You sure you want to do this? I've wanted to do this, I said. For years. By 9:45, the full board had arrived. Carson was last. He walked in with the kind of performative calm that only the guilty wear. Straight spine, forced smile, and eyes that wouldn't meet mine. The General Counsel opened the meeting with the agenda. Review of internal policy violations, unauthorized restructuring proposal, and executive leadership stability. That's what they called it. Stability. Ironic, really. There had been nothing stable about Carson's tenure for years. When the floor opened, I didn't read from notes. I didn't bring binders. I simply stood. For 30 years, I've watched this company drift from its purpose, I said. And for too long, I believed silence was a form of love. I thought stepping aside was how I supported my son. But silence doesn't protect legacy. It erases it. And today, I refuse to be erased. I sat down. That was all. No drama, no accusations, just truth. Carson stood next, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. I admit, he said, voice too tight, I've made mistakes, but restructuring was a thought exercise, not an executed plan. We're in the middle of a rebranding campaign. External noise like this could harm us. He didn't address the leaked email. He didn't apologize. He pivoted, deflected again. When he finished, the room fell into a tense silence. Then Peter, the youngest board member, said softly, "We're not voting on public image, Carson. We're voting on trust." One by one, hands were raised. It wasn't unanimous, but it didn't need to be. By a vote of 7-3, the board moved to suspend Carson from executive duties, pending further review. Effective immediately, Gabriel would serve as interim CEO, and I would oversee the transitional restructuring. Carson didn't speak. He didn't argue. He simply stood, slowly removed his badge and placed it on the table. His fingers lingered on it for a second too long, and then he looked at me. "Are you happy now?" he asked. I met his eyes. "No, but I'm no longer ashamed." The room cleared. Carson left without saying goodbye. I stayed behind, staring at the chair he had vacated, the same chair George once occupied, the same chair I had sat beside, not behind. Gabriel touched my shoulder. We did the right thing. I nodded. But it still hurts. Because it did. It wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge. It was grief for everything lost in the silence between a mother and son. But it was also necessary. The company was mine again. Not just on paper, but in purpose. 2 weeks passed. In that time, the headlines shifted. What once read like tabloid drama now spoke of revitalized leadership and Prescott Tech's bold return to its roots. Investors stopped hesitating, employees began smiling again, and for the first time in years, the company calendar included strategy meetings, not golf retreats. I didn't chase cameras. I didn't sit for interviews. I let the work speak. Let the culture shift one hallway conversation at a time. The biggest changes were quiet ones, reinstating mentoring programs, opening communication channels that had been shut for years, walking the floor with no entourage and no agenda. One afternoon, I passed by the break room and caught two interns whispering. "That's her," one said. "The maid?" the other whispered. "No," the first corrected. "The Prescott." I smiled. Not because they got it right, but because I no longer needed them to. The Sunday before our annual shareholder summit, I received an unexpected knock on my door. Carson. He stood on my porch with his hands in his pockets, looking nothing like the boy I raised or the executive who tried to erase me. He looked unsure. And that, more than anything, made me open the door. "I'm not here to argue," he said. "Good," I replied, stepping aside. We sat in the living room, the same room where he once practiced spelling words on the floor, the same room where I had cried quietly after George's funeral, while Carson disappeared behind company growth charts. He glanced at the photo on the mantel, the one of George and me at the very first product launch. My name had been cropped out in the company version. This one was whole. "You didn't need to do all of this," he said finally. "You already had the story, the truth." I looked at him carefully. "And what good is the truth if no one hears it?" He sighed. "I didn't know how to live up to you." "You didn't have to," I said gently. "You just had to stop trying to bury me." We sat in silence for a long while, and then quietly, he added, "You were right. I lost the company. I lost a lot. And now you know what it feels like to have something taken from you," I said. "I hope you never do that to someone else." He nodded. Not an apology, not quite, but something close. A crack, a start. When he left, he turned at the door. "Are you going to the summit?" "Of course." "Then I'll see you there," he said. "Just not at the podium." "No," I said. "Not this year." At the shareholder summit, I stood off to the side, near the back. Gabriel delivered the speech, a clean, forward-looking message that honored the past without dwelling in it. At the end, he gestured toward me, and I stepped forward, not to speak, but to stand, to be seen. The applause was different this time, not for a return, but for an arrival. When I left the stage, an older gentleman in a crisp navy suit stopped me near the elevators. "You don't remember me," he said, "but I saw you speak once, back when you and George were just getting started. I always wondered what happened to you." I smiled. "I was still here. You just didn't look hard enough." He paused, then chuckled. "Well, we're looking now." Back at home, I opened the drawer that held my old business cards, the ones I once thought I'd never use again. I tossed them in the fireplace, not out of anger, but because I didn't need them anymore. People finally knew who I was. I didn't need gold letters to prove it.